The Soviet partisans on the Eastern Front were independent groups of civilian fighters who worked towards the common goal of the Soviet Union, without the orders of a centralised command. The partisans were not a new trend in World War II, as Russia had help from partisans all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars when Napoleon had invaded Russia. They also had partisan units involved in World War I and the Russian Civil War, which had great success especially in Siberia during the Russian Civil War. As the German forces steamrolled their way through Russia, pushing aside the Red Army forces with ease, it wasn't until they hit Moscow and Stalingrad that their advance stopped. The Soviet military, reeling from heavy casualties and equipment losses, were doing everything they could to hold the line. But a silver lining came from the brave civilians who began to form partisan units, with the help from the remains of Red Army infantry units that had been destroyed, and destruction battalions. There were many reasons to join such units. Firstly, many were die-hard communists who would do anything for the motherland. Secondly, after seeing the destruction from the German invasion, many wished to push the Germans back from their homeland. And other reasons ranged simply from status, all the way to the fact that some people just wished to fight when there is a war. And they took men and women alike, as they needed anyone who was willing to fight. The total number of partisans is unknown, but estimates range all the way up to around 200,000 during their height in 1945, working throughout the Soviet Union. There are also around 106 large partisan groups, and thousands of smaller partisan bands ranging just from a few people at the smallest numbers. This also does not include partisans from the other nations. The partisans in Soviet territories caused the Germans extreme problems by raiding supply lines, supply trucks and supply depots, and using hit-and-run tactics to ambush small groups of patrolling soldiers and collaborators, and also killing officers and high-value civilian collaboration targets to cause the German forces to have less organisational effectiveness and to keep the local population from helping the Germans. The partisans also had a no-tolerance policy for any collaborators, and would execute them if anyone's found to help the Germans. This was later rescinded by Soviet High Command, as they wanted all Soviet citizens to be united against the German foe, and knew that infighting could lead to major domestic issues. And as the Soviets had done before, they could always clear up the problems with individuals with purges once the war was over. To actually join the partisan unit was no easy task, with new recruits not being given any weapons and would have to do menial labour jobs until they had earned the trust of said partisan brigade. And if the partisan failed this loyalty test, they would be executed, as would their family. Also, their family home would be burned to the ground. This was absolutely brutal, but it was also to send a clear message to any potential German-aligned infiltrators that whatever the Germans promised you as a reward, the risks were too great. This also mirrored the Germans' punishment for the partisans, which was also to execute anyone involved. Normally, this also meant innocent civilians would be killed, which encouraged more people to join and support partisan groups, a vicious cycle which would ultimately hurt the German forces massively on the Eastern Front. The real key to the partisans' success was the terrain that they used, with the partisans widely dispersed over thousands of miles of terrain, referring to operating dense forests and swamps, which were almost impossible to patrol and secure effectively, even with large amounts of manpower and support redeployed to this task. The partisans also had local knowledge of the land, with many having years of experience working and exploring these rough landscapes. This was especially useful in the swamps, as no one chose to go into them unless they had to. It also meant every time the partisans chose to strike, they could hide easily, and there was little chance the German forces could follow them or find their bases, which gave the partisans the chance to choose the battlefield, which most of the time meant they could choose when to fight or when to hide, giving them a huge advantage, and this led to the Germans' morale dropping and their paranoia going sky high. Not only was it the terrain that gave the partisans their edge, but the fairly poor state of Russia's railroad system and road coverage. There were few actual major supply lines that had to carry the bulk of the German supplies. This meant the partisans knew where the logistics had to move, and could easily set up ambushes and blow up bridges and cut down trees to kill or delay supply convoys. Another easy tactic was to simply open fire on supply convoys, then flee. This caused the Germans to respond, which wasted time, and every second loss was a second bought for the Russian forces on the front line. The partisans, even though relatively alone at the start, soon gained the interest of Soviet leadership. With their actions tying up German forces and stopping supplies reaching the front lines, the Soviet leadership knew this was a very valuable resource that needed to be cultivated, and with previous wars also proving the partisans' usefulness, there was no doubt that they were a vital part in saving the Soviet Union from the German foe. So in 1942 a central staff was set up in Russia to organise and direct the various partisan groups into a more conjoined effort, even though many groups would still pursue their own targets, as Stalin had said that they did not need to wait for orders to strike and to take every opportunity to hurt the German invader. Stalin also told central staff to make sure the partisans were well equipped, as every German they killed and every supply they stopped was one less the Red Army would have to face. And eventually, specially trained military volunteers, was sent and dropped into occupied German territory to help assist and guide local partisan forces to success. These volunteers were basically special forces and had the training to match. The equipment of partisan units varied a lot, especially until they were able to be supplied from Soviet forces. They were armed with everything from standard rifles, SMGs, LMGs of Russian make where they could get them. Also, any captured or stolen weaponry was very common, and until early 1943, the Soviets then began to supply partisan units with heavy mortars, machine guns, AT weaponry to amplify their combat power. Uniforms were a mix and match of stolen military uniforms and converted civilian clothing, and when it came to explosives, they were normally in short supply, as were mines, as they were prioritised for frontline units, so the partisans had to get inventive, and would use explosive devices, such as IEDs, multiple grenades strapped together. They would even take the explosives out of dud artillery shells and bombs that did not detonate, and then they used the good old-fashioned Molotov cocktail for when fire would suffice to do the job. Another supply issue the partisans faced was a lack of radio communication equipment, so when they needed to talk to Soviet command or the partisan units, they really had to get these. This was difficult as they were also prioritised for frontline units, but some did get through to them, especially after 1943, when supplies really did open up for the partisans. In some rare cases, partisan units grew very strong, and actually were as well armed as Red Army combat units, only lacking the vehicles, and they were fairly capable of going toe-to-toe with standard German army forces. This is quite a scary reality that hit the Germans, and they soon realised that the Eastern Front was not where the forces met the Red Army, but all around them. Russia was the Soviets' homeland, and the Germans began to realise this. The reason supplies could finally reach the partisans in 1943 was due to the Vibetsk Gate. This breach in the German front line, which occurred in winter 1942 thanks to the Soviet winter offensive. At first, Central Command didn't realise its importance as the terrain was rough and hard to navigate, but when local partisan units made contact, it became a priority to get supplies through and into the hands of these partisans. But not just weapons passed through the gate, also medical supplies, propaganda, and any supplies needed for the large partisan groups to operate effectively. The Vibetsk Gate was the lifeline many partisan units needed, and for this generous donation, they caused mayhem on the German forces, and Soviet command realised that the partisans were now key to winning the Eastern Front successfully and then pushing into German territory. As the Eastern Front swung into the Russians' favour, and Stalingrad was then liberated, morale with partisan units surged as they knew the Red Army was now on its way, and Stalin in 1943 ordered all partisan units to destroy the railway lines in German-held territory, mainly in western Belarus and the Ukrainian Oblast. This was the start of a massive increase in partisan activity against the Germans, with around 40 plus major attacks a day against German forces by partisans. Many of these being company-sized assaults which led to entire areas being controlled by partisan units. The Germans were under such threat that huge efforts were made to eliminate partisan forces, but with the Red Army pushing them back and attacks coming from all directions, this was an impossible endeavour. The railway attacks were not just to cause immediate damage, but also to stop German logistics and reinforcements getting to the front line before the massive Battle of Kursk. The Russians knew this engagement would be major, and if the Germans won the Eastern Front could then be turned back in their favour. So focusing partisan efforts on helping win the Battle of Kursk was priority, and the partisans did not disappoint, with around 230,000 rail lines destroyed or damaged, and bridges, locomotives and carriages destroyed and burned to pieces. In some rare cases, as the war began to look bleak for Germany and its allies, collaborator units of police and locals who supported SS forces began to fully switch back to the Russian side and join partisan forces. This was likely due to these units realising the war was lost for the Germans, but also to switch before they were caught and executed by partisan forces. And even though Stalin's Central Command told partisan units to forgive these collaborators and work with them, many did not, and chose to execute them instead, which is understandable, as if you were fighting your enemy and they suddenly decide to switch side, you don't normally welcome them with open arms. As the German forces were pushed back further by partisan units, it began to come into more direct engagement with them, and from 1944 onwards, partisans were really digging into German forces. They were now basically infantry units and would help Russian forces push further into German territory. But even though the Eastern Front was being won by the Soviets, many partisan units had other issues which began to arise. One major issue was the fact that many partisan brigades did not get on with the fact that foreign partisan units sprang up, and this did cause some conflicts. One interesting example is the Polish resistance in its self-defense brigades, which suffered much persecution from German and Soviet forces, but did cooperate with the Soviets following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This was done very warily, especially by the Poles, as the Soviets had invaded Poland with the Germans in 1939. As the war went on and Polish resistance discovered that the Soviet partisans and Soviet forces had committed many atrocities against the Polish people, the short-term alliance was broken, and after this, Soviet partisans were told to target Polish resistance units. This actually culminated in some Polish units working with German forces against the Soviet partisans, but this was very rare and condemned by the Polish resistance themselves. The Soviet government is also culpable for the fact it encouraged partisan units to make the Germans lash out, knowing that the civilians would be targeted at a 1 to 100 kill ratio for every German and Allied troop that was killed. Obviously, the Germans are to blame for the people they killed, but the Soviet government did not care how many civilians had to die for this plan to make more people be anti-German and support partisan units. Unfortunately, this is a major theme with the Soviet regime. It had little care for its people, many times in history, which is a true shame as many interesting and wonderful cultures were part of the Soviet Union, with many being greatly harmed by this short-term thinking. The Soviet partisans themselves also faced vigorous tests once the areas were liberated, and they were not needed in combat anymore. They would all be interrogated by the Russian Internal Security Force, the NKVD, and any partisan individuals that had ideas that did not align with the Soviet communist regime would either be sent to the gulags or killed. They got no leeway whatsoever. It did not matter that these people had fought against the Germans and saved thousands of Soviet lives, which resulted in the Eastern Front being turned to the Soviet advantage a lot earlier than would have been possible. These people were persecuted no matter what actions they had done to benefit the Soviet regime. It was not only the Soviet Union that had partisans that contributed to the Eastern Front. Many pre-Soviet countries also did. There were Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and many even smaller nations that had partisan movements that were worth their salt and did lots to help fight against the Germans on the Eastern Front and ultimately win World War II and help the Soviet Union establish the mighty empire that followed. In the end, the Soviet partisans had done a huge service to the Soviet Union, causing disarray and disruption to the invading Germans, and had helped win the Eastern Front with their guerrilla actions. They had saved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and allowed the Russians to push the Germans back probably years quicker than it would have been able to otherwise. But as we have seen, they still face persecution and reprisals after the war, and it shows allies of convenience don't always last. But I salute these brave men and women who joined partisan forces. They went through a true ordeal, they were tough, they were committed, and that you really do have to respect. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. And I'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching, everyone, and you guys have a fantastic day.